In the summer of 1945, across the wide, sun-drenched plains of the American Midwest, a train slowed to a halt. Its heavy iron doors creaked open, and a small group of German women, weary from the war and heavy with uncertainty, stepped down onto the unfamiliar soil. Among them was Portia, a young woman whose life until that moment had been shaped entirely by the rigid boundaries of Nazi Germany. The air was thick with heat and the scent of grain fields, a world far removed from the bomb-scarred cities they had left behind. They expected hostility, humiliation, perhaps even cruelty. German propaganda had promised them that America was a nation of chaos, of vulgar women and ruthless men who despised them. Yet as Portia's eyes adjusted to this new land, the first sight that startled her was not barbed wire or armed hostility, but women, American women, moving with a confidence and independence she had never known. Women in trousers working the rail yards, women with notebooks in hand directing logistics, women stepping forward to speak openly to soldiers without hesitation. The contradiction was immediate, unsettling, and unforgettable. How could a prisoner, raised to believe that her gender consigned her to silence, suddenly witness her captor's women command respect in public? For Portia and others, the questions began at that very moment. Had they been lied to all along? And what did this freedom mean for their own future? The story of Portia and of the other German women who became prisoners of war in America cannot be understood without stepping back into the collapsing world of Nazi Germany. By the early 1940s, their homeland was engulfed in a vision crafted by propaganda. Women were told their duty was to the family, to the kitchen, and to the children who would grow the Reich. Opportunities beyond those narrow lines were stripped away, unless they served the state's militarized needs. Universities that once offered women paths into scholarship or science closed those doors. Political power was reserved for men. Even in the war effort, women were expected to remain auxiliaries, silent supporters in uniforms, but rarely in command. For someone like Portia, born into a society that insisted obedience was her virtue, the idea of equality was not just foreign, it was unthinkable. But war does not respect ideology. As the Allies advanced and Germany faltered, more and more civilians were swept into captivity. By 1944, with cities reduced to rubble and the Wehrmacht fractured, even women found themselves among those captured in the chaos. Some had served as auxiliary staff, translators, or nurses near the front. Others were caught in sweeping roundups after military units disintegrated. Portia's capture came in the aftermath of one such retreat. Her role as a clerk in a logistics typhoon office placing her directly in the path of Allied soldiers. She had imagined prison camps in Russia, starvation or abuse. Instead, she was placed on transports bound for America, an almost inconceivable destination. The United States, thousands of miles from the devastation of Europe, faced an unusual dilemma. By 1945, it held nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war. While the Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, many Americans wondered, what should be done with these captives? The government scattered them into camps across the country, often in rural areas where local farmers needed labor. For the first time, communities in places like Texas, Kansas, and the Dakotas witnessed enemy soldiers working in their fields, repairing roads, or chopping timber. These POWs were fed, clothed, and housed with resources unimaginable in the starving heart of Europe. Portia and her fellow women were rare among these groups, but their presence carried special weight. They arrived with the indoctrinated belief that women's freedom led to moral collapse. Nazi officials had insisted that American women were decadent, abandoning family values to chase selfish ambitions. Yet, from the moment they stepped onto American soil, the contradiction screamed at them. Women here were visible, assertive, and unashamed. They were not confined to the shadows of domestic life. They were teachers, drivers, mechanics, and, in many cases, heads of households while their husbands fought overseas. This was no accident. World War II had ignited a transformation in the United States. With millions of men serving abroad, American women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became the icon of the age, her rolled-up sleeves a symbol of determination. Nearly 6 million women took jobs in factories, shipyards, and offices. They earned wages of their own, managed finances, and discovered a voice in public life. Though many would later be pressured back into domestic roles, the genie of equality had already escaped its bottle. For Portia, encountering this reality was like stepping into an alternate universe. The central question, then, was inescapable. What happens when women raised in the strict confines of Nazi ideology are confronted with a society where their gender is not only visible, but powerful? Would they cling to their old worldview, or would the seeds of change take root? The camps themselves became unexpected classrooms for this cultural collision. In guarded compounds, German prisoners read American newspapers, listened to radios, and sometimes attended classes offered by local universities. Letters home were censored but revealing, carrying hints of admiration and bewilderment at what they saw around them. Food was plentiful, sometimes even luxurious compared to the rations at home. Medical care was professional, education was possible, and above all, American women were not invisible. They were everywhere, shaping the rhythm of daily life. For Portia, each day brought new evidence that contradicted everything she had been taught. She had entered captivity expecting degradation. Instead, she found herself in a society where women could raise their voices, walk unescorted, and even challenge men in authority without fear of punishment. These revelations did not come gently. They arrived as shocks, like strikes of lightning against a carefully constructed worldview. And with each shock, the tension inside her grew. Could she believe her eyes? Or should she remain loyal to the world she left behind? This was more than the story of one young woman. It was a story of cultural collision, of ideology meeting reality, of human beings forced to question the very foundations of their identity. For Portia, and for countless others, captivity in America became less a punishment and more a confrontation with possibility, and it would change her forever. But to understand how deeply these revelations shook her, we must return to the beginning of her captivity, to the moment of capture itself, and the fragile hopes and fears she carried across the Atlantic. The spring of 1944 found Germany at the edge of collapse. Allied forces pressed from the west, the Soviets advanced from the east, and what once seemed an invincible Reich began to fracture under the weight of reality. For Portia, a young woman assigned to clerical work in a military supply office, the war was already a personal catastrophe. Cities were reduced to smoldering ruins, food was scarce, and the sense of certainty that had defined her childhood under the Nazi system had dissolved into fear. She knew the Allied advance was inevitable, yet when capture finally came, it was no less shocking. Her unit, retreating chaotically from France, was surrounded by American troops. The air reeked of diesel and dust as tanks rolled in, and the clamor of shouted orders echoed across the fields. Portia had no weapon. Her role had been in papers, not rifles. Still, the fear of retribution pulsed through her. She had grown up with Nazi propaganda that painted Allied soldiers as brutes, eager to humiliate or destroy any German who fell into their hands. Women, she had been told, would suffer most. Yet when she raised her hands and stepped forward, the response was not assault, but efficiency. She and others were marched to makeshift holding camps, processed, and placed under guard. The early days were filled with uncertainty. She watched soldiers catalog her belongings, confiscate documents, and lead her into wire-fenced enclosures. She listened for signs of cruelty, raised voices, blows, or derision, but instead she found an orderly calm. Guards handed out blankets and rations, plain but sufficient. They spoke in English, words she barely understood, but their tone was not the harsh one she expected. Still, suspicion clung to her. The enemy, she reminded herself, could not be trusted. When she was told she would be shipped overseas, disbelief swept through the camp. America was a distant abstraction, a place painted in propaganda as vulgar and corrupt, filled with people who mocked decency and worshipped greed. The ocean voyage only deepened her anxiety. On the transport ship, she huddled with other women and young men, whispering what they had been told, that American cities were lawless, their people hostile, their treatment of prisoners merciless. Some said they would be paraded like trophies. Others whispered of starvation camps hidden far from view. The reality on arrival was bewildering. After days at sea, the first glimpse of the American coastline shimmered like a mirage. Ports bustling with life, ships loading cargo, and civilians moving freely, all in sharp contrast to the wreckage of Germany, left her unsettled. But it was only upon stepping off the train into the heartland that her expectations were most deeply challenged. Portia expected punishment. She anticipated jeers, perhaps even violence, from civilians who had lost sons and brothers to the war. Instead, many local communities seemed curious more than hostile. In rural areas where German POWs were sent to relieve labor shortages, townspeople lined the roads not with weapons, but with baskets of produce, staring at the newcomers with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. To Portia, the absence of open hatred was almost incomprehensible. Inside the camp, conditions startled her further. The barracks were plain but intact, without the squalor she imagined. Cots were lined in neat rows, blankets folded, and stoves supplied warmth. Meals, though modest, were far richer than the watery soups she remembered from her final months in Germany. White bread, meat, and even coffee, luxuries she had not tasted in years, were placed before her. At first, she hesitated to eat, suspecting some trick. Yet hunger overcame doubt, and with each bite, she realized her captors provided food not as cruelty, but as a matter of policy. Still, the indoctrination of years did not disappear overnight. In whispered conversations, Portia and other women spoke of their fears. Surely this comfort was temporary, they reasoned. Surely humiliation would follow. They feared being put on display, mocked for their weakness, or forced into degrading labor. The image of American women they carried was equally distorted. Nazi rhetoric had depicted them as reckless, unfeminine, and dishonorable. The very embodiment of what happened when women stepped outside their natural role. Portia braced herself to see evidence of that corruption, expecting her captors' women to confirm every warning she had been taught. But as the days stretched into weeks, her certainty began to erode. Every encounter with the outside world chipped away at the wall of propaganda she had lived behind. The calm discipline of American guards contradicted the stories of brutality. The abundance of food contradicted tales of poverty. And the first glimpses of American women, working shoulder to shoulder with men, issuing orders, and moving with a self-assurance unimaginable back home, posed the most jarring contradiction of all. These early days were defined by tension, the tug of loyalty to what she had been told, against the undeniable evidence of her own senses. Could she trust what she saw? Or was this merely another deception, one more layer of propaganda designed to unmake her? For Portia, captivity was no longer just about survival. It had become a collision between two realities, one she had been taught and one she was beginning to witness. And the question that haunted her was this: if America's women truly lived with such rights and freedoms, what did that mean for her own life, her own worth, and the world she once believed unshakable? The first weeks of captivity in America revealed a series of shocks that Portia could not have predicted. Each one chipped away at the rigid certainty she had carried across the Atlantic, leaving her with a growing sense of disorientation. What unsettled her most was not cruelty, but kindness, and not degradation, but dignity. The first shock came with food. In Germany, scarcity had become the rhythm of daily life. Long queues for a scrap of bread, thin soups, and the gnawing of hunger defined her final months before capture. Yet in the American camp, she was given 3 meals a day. Portions were generous. Meat appeared regularly, as did vegetables, fruit, and even sweets. The white bread alone seemed a luxury beyond imagination. At first, she approached it with suspicion, half convinced it was a trick to lower their defenses. But as days passed and hunger softened into fullness, the truth became undeniable. Her captors fed her better than her own government had. Medical care delivered another surprise. When one of the women fell ill with fever, an American physician was summoned. Portia watched as the doctor, a man with no personal connection to them and every reason to despise them, treated the prisoner with the same professionalism he might show a fellow citizen. Medicines, bandages, and rest were provided without hesitation. The idea that an enemy would extend compassion to a German woman was difficult to comprehend. What did it mean, Portia wondered, that in this enemy land, a stranger could value her health more than the Reich, that once demanded her loyalty? Housing, too, carried unexpected comfort. The barracks were basic but orderly, insulated against the cold and supplied with stoves. There were bunks, not straw. There were communal spaces where prisoners could sit, read, or write. To Portia, who had been prepared for filth and neglect, these conditions felt almost unreal. She thought of the devastation in her homeland. Families crammed into ruined cellars, children sleeping on bare ground, and could not reconcile the difference. But the greatest shock of all was outside the camp, where glimpses of American society unfolded before her eyes. When Portia was assigned to work details, she saw American women moving with authority and independence. On a farm, she observed a woman instructing prisoners and guards alike on how to handle machinery. Her voice was firm, her authority unquestioned. The men around her did not mock her, nor did they treat her as a curiosity. They simply obeyed. In Germany, such a scene would have been unthinkable. Women could manage households, yes, but to command men openly in public? That defied everything Portia had been told about the natural order of the world. She saw women driving trucks, teaching classrooms, managing stores, and collecting wages in envelopes they could spend as they pleased. They walked freely through town without escorts. They debated politics at gatherings. They voted in elections. These were not the caricatures of decadence she had been warned about, but ordinary women living with freedoms she could scarcely imagine claiming for herself. Letters sent home by other POWs reflected the same astonishment. One prisoner wrote that American women are louder than their men, and they do not fear speaking in public. Another described how women held jobs that in Germany were strictly male, remarking with disbelief, "Here, even a woman may become a foreman." Such testimonies circulated among the captives, fueling long conversations in the barracks. The reactions were not uniform. Some of the women admired what they saw, whispering that perhaps their mothers and sisters had been cheated of lives that could have been richer. Others rejected it outright, insisting it was a temporary illusion, a trick of wartime necessity. They clung to the Nazi image of the dutiful mother, the silent wife, the loyal servant of the family. For Portia, the emotions were more complex. She was unsettled, intrigued, and afraid all at once. The sight of American women standing tall forced her to question not only propaganda, but her own worth. If women could live like this, why had she been told her destiny was only silence? Even within the camp, small moments became revelations. Female American staff spoke to guards as equals. Women clerks filed reports and organized shipments. In one instance, Portia saw a young American woman reprimand a male guard for mishandling paperwork. The man apologized, visibly embarrassed. Such an exchange in Germany would have been unthinkable, yet here it passed without incident, as though nothing unusual had occurred. At night, these images replayed in her mind. She could not dismiss them. She could not reconcile them with the certainty she had carried into captivity. The walls of ideology, built brick by brick through years of propaganda, now showed cracks. But cracks, once they appear, have a way of spreading. For Portia, the first shocks were only the beginning. Ahead lay a deeper confrontation, as each passing month revealed contradictions too powerful to ignore. And the question that lingered was this: if the enemy treated her with dignity, and if their women lived with freedom, what did that say about the truth she had once believed beyond question? As the months of captivity stretched on, the contradictions in Portia's life grew sharper, impossible to dismiss as accidents or illusions. What began as small shocks, food, housing, glimpses of American women, slowly accumulated into a pattern that undermined the very foundations of her worldview. Each day seemed to whisper the same uncomfortable truth. The reality before her eyes bore little resemblance to the world she had been told to believe in. One of the most striking contradictions emerged in the realm of entertainment and education. The camp offered prisoners the chance to attend lectures, learn English, and even take courses provided by nearby universities. To Portia, this was astonishing. In Germany, knowledge had been tightly controlled, filtered through ideology, and narrowed to suit the Reich's purposes. Here, she saw men and women alike encouraged to study freely. She noticed American women attending classes alongside men, raising questions without hesitation, debating openly. The idea that education belonged to both genders equally was revolutionary to her. It raised an unsettling question. Why had she been denied the same opportunities in her homeland? Work assignments outside the camp deepened her bewilderment. On local farms, she saw American women operating tractors, negotiating wages, and running businesses while their husbands fought overseas. Some women managed entire farms with efficiency and authority, commanding respect from hired hands and neighbors. Their independence was not seen as shameful, but necessary and even admirable. When a farmer's wife gave her orders about stacking hay bales or tending crops, Portia felt an internal struggle. Part of her recoiled at the inversion of gender roles. Another part, quieter but growing stronger, felt a flicker of admiration. The contradictions multiplied in everyday interactions. Guards often treated her with a detached politeness, not cruelty. Some even exchanged casual greetings. Once, when Portia struggled to carry a crate, a young American soldier offered to help without mockery or disdain. She could not reconcile this simple act of kindness with the monstrous image painted by German propaganda. Letters home added another layer of tension. Though censored, they revealed glimpses of the POWs' shifting perspectives. Some wrote in cautious code about the abundance of food, the relative comfort of their quarters, or the astonishing sight of women in positions of authority. These letters, though carefully phrased, became points of discussion in the barracks. For Portia, the words confirmed what her own eyes had already seen. America was not the wasteland she had been taught to expect, but such realizations came with moral dilemmas. If she accepted the truth of her captivity, then she had to admit that the Reich had lied, not just about America, but about the nature of women themselves. To do so felt dangerous, even disloyal. She feared that abandoning belief meant betraying her family and her homeland. Yet silence could not stop the gnawing sense that she was witnessing something fundamentally better than the life she had left behind. Her internal conflict escalated during a town visit organized under guard. Prisoners were marched through streets lined with shops and businesses. To her astonishment, women stood behind many of the counters. They handled money, managed transactions, and spoke with authority to customers, male and female alike. The normalcy of it unsettled her most. This was not propaganda, not staged theater. It was ordinary life in America. The climax of these contradictions came one evening when an American newspaper reached the camp. Though she could not read English fluently, a fellow prisoner translated an article describing women's participation in recent elections. Women had not only voted but campaigned, spoken publicly, and shaped policy. To Portia, this was beyond imagination. In her world, women were told their voices had no place in politics. To see evidence of the opposite, printed in the pages of a national paper, shook her to the core. In private moments, she began to reflect on her own life. What dreams had she never allowed herself to consider? What ambitions had been silenced before they even formed? Watching American women live with choices denied to her, Portia felt a quiet grief for the life she might have lived under different circumstances. Yet with grief came possibility. The cracks in her ideology widened into fissures, and the contradictions that once seemed troubling began to feel like glimpses of a larger truth. Perhaps, she thought, freedom was not corruption. Perhaps dignity could exist beyond obedience. But with every new realization, a deeper question emerged. If she embraced what she saw in America, what would await her when the war ended and she returned to Germany? Would she be able to accept again the narrow confines of silence and obedience? Or had captivity forever changed her? The contradictions no longer merely unsettled her. They demanded a choice. And as the war drew to a close, the approach of liberation promised not only freedom from captivity, but a reckoning with the truths she had discovered. When Portia finally returned to Germany, the ruins of her homeland stood as stark reminders of a war that had consumed everything. Cities lay in rubble, families were shattered, and hunger once again stalked the streets. Yet within her, something endured that the war could not erase. In the quiet corners of her memory, the images of America remained. Women standing tall in classrooms, steering machinery, voting in elections, and speaking their minds without fear. For many returning prisoners, captivity had been a strange education. They had expected punishment, but had discovered dignity. They had braced for humiliation, but had encountered respect. And for women like Portia, the experience was more than survival. It was an awakening. They carried back not just stories of food and shelter, but glimpses of another possible life. One where womanhood was not silence, but voice. The long-term consequences were subtle, but real. In post-war Germany, as democracy slowly returned, seeds of change took root. Women began to push for greater equality. Their demands, shaped in part by the quiet testimonies of those who had once lived as captives, yet had seen freedom up close. Portia's journey reminds us that captivity does not always destroy. Sometimes it reveals. Her story is not only about a prisoner of war, but about the collapse of illusion and the birth of possibility. And the final question that lingers is one that stretches far beyond her lifetime. When we are confronted with a better vision of what life could be, do we have the courage to carry it forward, even when the world around us resists? By 1945, the war in Europe had ended. For Portia, the news arrived not with fanfare, but with a heavy silence that settled over the camp like a fog. Germany had surrendered. The Reich, which had demanded absolute obedience and promised eternal victory, was gone. The women who had been taught to see themselves as small pieces in a great machine now faced a different reality. They were prisoners of a defeated nation, their future uncertain, their beliefs shaken. The final months of captivity became a crucible of transformation. With Germany's collapse, the propaganda that had bound Portia's imagination lost its force. The contradictions she had experienced no longer clashed with ideology. They became proof that her old world had been built on lies. And yet, the process of acceptance was not immediate. It came with struggle, grief, and, ultimately, clarity. The pivotal moment for Portia came during an organized lecture inside the camp. American instructors had been invited to speak on democracy, Reconstruction, and women's roles in modern society. Portia sat among other prisoners, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the speaker. The lecturer was a woman, confident, articulate, and unafraid to challenge the audience. She spoke of women's suffrage, of the right to vote, of the responsibility to participate in civic life. Her words were measured, calm, yet brimming with conviction. For Portia, it was as though a veil had been torn away. Never in her life had she heard a woman speak publicly with authority to men, especially to enemy soldiers. It was more than shocking, it was transformative. The image of a woman commanding attention, not because of her connection to a man, but because of her own knowledge and voice, pierced through every barrier of doubt. She realized in that instant that her entire life had been lived within walls she had not chosen, walls designed to keep her silent. And here, before her eyes, was proof that those walls could be broken. The climax of her transformation was not a single decision, but an awakening of identity. She was no longer merely a captive, passively enduring the will of others. She was a witness to a new model of womanhood, and once seen, it could not be unseen. She began to imagine herself differently, not as the obedient shadow she had been told to be, but as someone capable of speaking, deciding, and shaping her own destiny. This realization carried both exhilaration and sorrow. Exhilaration, because she felt a stirring of possibility. Sorrow, because she knew that returning to Germany meant re-entering a world that had not yet embraced such freedoms. The war had destroyed the Reich, but cultural expectations would not crumble overnight. Would her homeland ever allow women to live as fully as she had seen in America? Her transformation deepened when repatriation approached. As she prepared to leave, American officials distributed pamphlets about rebuilding Europe, about democracy, and about civic duty. Women were encouraged to imagine themselves as active participants in shaping the future. Portia clutched the paper with trembling hands, reading each word as though it were a secret treasure. For her, the greatest lesson of captivity was not about defeat, but about possibility. When the day of departure came, the camp gates opened not into more captivity, but into freedom. Yet the freedom was bittersweet. For many, the journey home meant returning to destroyed cities, to fractured families, and to societies that had not yet embraced the equality they had glimpsed abroad. On the train that carried her eastward, Portia gazed through the window, watching the American countryside slide past one final time. She thought of the women she had seen driving trucks, running farms, teaching in classrooms, and speaking with authority. She thought of the lecturer whose words had struck her so deeply, and she wondered if she could carry those images within her as a compass, even when her surroundings tried to silence her once more. The climax of Portia's captivity was not liberation itself, but the transformation that had taken place within her. The propaganda of her childhood had collapsed completely, leaving in its place a fragile but powerful belief that women could live differently, that they could claim dignity and freedom beyond the roles imposed upon them. For Portia, the end of captivity was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a lifelong reckoning with the truths she had seen in America, truths that would echo long after she stepped onto German soil again.